and welcome to episode 142 of our SAP on Azure video podcast. Today's May 4th. May the 4th be with you. And together with Robert and Goran, we're here to talk about anything related to SAP and Microsoft. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
So today we get back to one of my favorite topics, which is Power Platform and SAP. So although Power Platform enables almost anyone to create applications and connect them to SAP, one of the things that I always highlight is the importance of single sign-on. If you have SSO in place, then you can leverage all your roles and profiles and permissions that you have maintained in the SAP system. To set up SSO can sometimes be a challenge, but with the new SAP ERP Connector, the configuration for using Kerberos has been simplified quite a bit. Today we have Martin Raepple joining us again to show us how the full end-to-end flow works and also take a look at some of the configurations. But before we hand over to him, as always, let's quickly take a look at some of the news from this week. And basically, just when we finished the recording of our last episode, the DSAG Investment Report was released. So every year, the DSAG, the German-speaking SAP user group, does a survey among their 4,000 customers or something like that. And they asked them a few questions like, what's the investment? What are critical areas that you see in 23 and so on? And it's always very, very insightful. So for example, one good thing is IT budgets are increasing, which is also good because when you look at what are these investment areas, Business Suite is declining, S/4HANA is very much increasing. So we can definitely see that more and more customers are now looking and using and adopting S/4HANA. And then there are a lot of other things here. BTP, the Business Technology Platform, is a central element in the SAP strategy. Yeah, here 24% say that they're using it. So it's very clear where the direction is going, and also that customers are now really adopting the scenarios that SAP is really highlighting. One thing that I also found really interesting is the focus on security. Let me see if I find this here. Yeah, here. So it's very, very clear. 88% are saying that cybersecurity is something that is really important for them. So I think in the last months and weeks, we could clearly see that there are all these attacks happening, not only to SAP systems, but in general. And that's, I think, why a lot of companies just say, look, security is top of mind. And just in the last few episodes, we had talked about Azure Sentinel for SAP and the way how Azure technology can help you to protect your SAP system. So there's lots of more information. Take some time, read through it. I think it's really very interesting to look through. The next thing is general zone redundant storage, Goran.
Yeah, so last time we had high availability discussion and topic with Ralica, deep dive. It is so it's always also useful here a kind of announcement of zonal redundant storage for the premium SSD and standard SSD premium is used in SAP context in the new regions in Southeast Asia, Australia East, and Qatar. I know the customer going there as well, and therefore always sometimes not all the components will be available somewhere. So that's very useful part for the SAP, especially for the high availability in the context of zonal redundant shared disk. They are used both on Windows and Linux clustering. Mm-hmm. On Windows is used for the shared disk for the essential services. On Linux, they don't use a shared disk for this purpose, but you can use basically for SBD as a SBD device as well, basically because they do this fencing. And on a SUSE, this is one of the fencing mechanism as shared disk as well. It's also a kind of cheaper way to have this device, so to say. So very interesting information, helpful. Really looking forward to see that also other regions are kind of expanding. So meaning different SAP architectural scenarios are also possible in those regions as well. Exactly, in 3 of them as well. Yeah.
Perfect. Cool, great. Then moving on, a colleague of ours, Amit Lal, has created a blog post on 7 AI related scenarios, which I thought was also really quite interesting. We talked about AI a lot of times in the past, and obviously we see a lot of interest there in the combination with SAP. And what Amit does in this blog post, he highlights 7 scenarios. Basically, yeah, he called them whiteboard scenarios, where he's saying, look, these are things where AI in combination with your SAP systems or with SAP processes that you have in your company could make sense or could really enhance and help with the productivity. So yeah, automating sales order creation from email requests. I think we've been seeing some related demos there already, and it's really nice just to read through them to get some inspirations, I would say, to really see that this combination of OpenAI, the different services that we have there, how they can really help you in the SAP context. And actually, speaking of this topic, I think we had talked about the Microsoft AI SDK for SAP, and Gopal has been extremely busy there. So here you don't see a lot of difference, but actually, if you click here on the documentation, then he has created a very detailed documentation. So if you go here, you have all the things that are required to set up Azure OpenAI. Then he talks about how to install the Microsoft AI SDK using ABAP Git. He talks about how to actually use the SDK, so showing some simple ABAP programs of how you can then interact with your SAPs with Azure OpenAI. So it's really fantastic. If you haven't checked it out, then give it a try. It is free. I mean, it is available on GitHub. So the only thing that you need to do is have the ABAP Git installed, which again is free. So you can just install this on your sandbox. Maybe use the Cloud Appliance Library to spin up a quick system and give it a try, and then just test it. It's really amazing how easy it is for the ABAP developer to consume Azure OpenAI services with this. The next thing is according or in line with the topic that we also want to talk about. James Wood published this blog post on Microsoft Power Platform, more than just a toy, and I really love this article because he addresses a lot of concerns that are raised from customers from time to time. So is it really productive ready? Is it really good to also work in the context of SAP? And he really explains, look, it's built on Azure foundations. He talks about the fusion of teams, that yes, there are different skills required in a company, but with this combination or really bringing the different teams within your company together, then that's actually the scenario where the Power Platform and other services really make most of the sense. He talks about the user interface of some of the apps, which I'm not a good designer, and my Power apps never look really good. But he outlines that you can build beautiful apps there. But similar, like there are people that build beautiful PowerPoint presentations, and there are people that don't build so good PowerPoint applications. So that's really he has a really nice blog post there where he outlines how he sees also the usage of the Power Platform with his customers. So I thought that was also really nice. The last thing that I want to mention before we hand over to Martin. So remember, I think last week we started with this prompt of the week. So I had these discussions with Martin Pankratz a few weeks ago, and we said, look, there are so many things where we are actually impacted now in a good way by OpenAI, how we are using OpenAI, ChatGPT in our daily work. And we said, let's look for a prompt of the week, basically. So we also already had some discussions with customers and partners. And if you have a good prompt, then let us know. And maybe we can also talk about this here. What I want to highlight today is, for a recent customer project, I needed to create an Azure API Management scenario where I had a service that would call Azure API Management, and Azure API Management would redirect the call to different backend systems. And you can do this. I mean, there are beautiful policies. There's a huge GitHub repository with Azure policies available. But actually, there's a lot of lookup required. So what I did is I just said, well, I'm using Azure API Management. I would like to create a policy that looks at the incoming request, extracts the value from a property called, and I just called it x_2. Depending on this property, the call should be redirected to a different website. And when it's Europe, then it should be, and I just for simplicity's sake said, then do a search with Europe. If it's US, then search with US. So I just used this specific prompt. And then if I switch over here to the chat, then, wait, okay, let me put this again in the prompt. Then it started to do the OpenAI magic. And as a result, let's see if it's the same results this time as in my tests. As a result, here's the example, perfect. Well, it doesn't look exactly like what I was hoping for, actually. Maybe I need to set the status to be more precise. Let me do this again. Because what I wanted to highlight actually is I literally was able to copy and paste the policy that was created here, paste it into Azure API Management, and then I had the policy that did the lookup in the incoming request, that had a selection there that allowed me to really then do the redirect from Europe to the backend from the different services. So that was absolutely amazing. And no, it's not working this time. But okay, and then we need to play around a little more with this. But let me do one thing. Can you show me the actual policy? Let's give it a try if this works. If not, then we'll stop it here.
This is not planned, right?
No, this is not planned. I had it actually tested before. Oh no, okay, he's not able to do that. I don't know why this is not working now.
But it didn't, I mean, less precise mode, something generated was.
Okay, let's do one. No, okay. We'll give it a try the next time. So I explicitly wanted to use, last time I think we used Azure OpenAI, and there, so really in my Azure subscription, there everything worked fine. So this time I wanted to explicitly use Bing, but for some reason that didn't work out. But next week we'll take another look and we'll use yet another tool with a different prompt, and then hopefully it will work even better. With this, let's switch topics. Martin, you have been here before, but still, maybe you can quickly introduce yourself.
Yes.
And then I'm looking forward to the demo that you have prepared.
Okay, yeah, thanks Holger, and thanks Goran for inviting me again to your podcast. Quickly introduce myself, Martin Raepple, with Microsoft now for more than 3.5 years. I've been also working for SAP for quite some long time before, mainly in the area of security, identity and access management, single sign-on. Those were the topics at my time at SAP as a product owner. And now I'm also focusing on those topics if I'm allowed to. And I think together with Holger, we recently took a look at the announcements that were made end of last year from the Power Platform around new features in the SAP ERP Connector. And that actually brought us to the idea, okay, let's take a look at a complete end-to-end scenario so that we simply get a better idea and also can document for our joint customers how these things work really from an end-to-end perspective. And 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 that's what we did. So we closely collaborated also here with the product group for the Power Platform. And and this is just a screenshot of the announcement that was made on December 16th, so end of last year. And if you click on the link in this announcement, at the lower part of it, there is the feature list of or the new features that were added to the on-premises data gateway. And I highlighted the one that we will actually focus on today in this session, in this podcast, where an enhanced single sign-on support has been added as a new feature that allows you essentially to implement seamless single sign-on using the SAP ERP Connector, using Kerberos Delegation to ensure that single sign-on is now a seamless experience between Power Apps, Power Automate, and SAP. Besides that, there were also other very interesting features added by the Power Platform, such as pre-built apps and Power Automate flows. Yeah, but the one that we want to focus on today in the demo that I prepared for this podcast, we want to focus exactly on this enhanced single sign-on feature. And because it also nicely fits into what I did already or presented here in this video podcast series a while ago, I'm coming back to the scenario that we covered in, I think, episode 40 in a minute. Let me quickly give you, before we jump into the demo and the setup, a quick recap or refresher what this Kerberos delegation means, as it is explicitly also mentioned in this announcement. So Kerberos delegation essentially means that you can use Kerberos as a very common and still very common, some argue it's already a very legacy protocol for single sign-on, but it's still very widely used. And especially in an SAP context, it has definitely still its relevance and importance because, as you, I think for sure know, if you want to allow a single sign-on using the SAP GUI, there is no other way than using the Secure Network Communication (SNC) protocol, which supports Kerberos as a means to allow single sign-on from for example, Active Directory to the SAP system using SAP GUI. Another very common use case is single sign-on to remote function calls and BAPIs. Yeah, and this is exactly also the use case and scenario that we focus on here today. Yeah? But let me quickly give you here a quick summary what Kerberos constraint or Kerberos delegation in general and constraint delegation means. It essentially means that a client that is able to obtain a Kerberos ticket from a key distribution center, such as an Active Directory, presents that ticket to a so-called delegate, which is in this picture illustrated here as the data gateway, and that data gateway then is able to obtain a new ticket from the key distribution center in Kerberos, so Active Directory, for example, to act on behalf of that user at the client to call another downstream service, such as, for example, an SAP system. Yeah. Another example would be a web server sitting in between the two, and a web server that requires to retrieve a file system from a file server on behalf of that user. And you usually do this because you want to enforce all of the users' authorizations on that backend service, so that security is enforced throughout the whole call chain from the client to the backend. Yeah? And in SAP's documentation, usually those scenarios are referred to as principal propagation. Yeah? That's exactly what Kerberos delegation actually implements. Yeah, so it's a means to propagate, so to forward the principal, the authenticated user, all the way from the client via this data gateway or delegate to the backend service. Yeah? And principal propagation has been also our key topic our main topic in episode 40, where we first also introduced such a scenario in the context of Power Platform and SAP. If you remember, or if you recall episode 40, then what we did here, we showed a scenario, an end-to-end scenario, where the user logged into a Power Virtual Agents chatbot. And that chatbot retrieved data from an SAP backend using an OData service. And again, the requirement here was to seamlessly single sign on the user all the way to the SAP backend system without, for example, prompting the user again in the chatbot for any sorts of credentials to access the SAP backend system. So again, a seamless propagation of the authenticated user in the chatbot all the way to the SAP system. We already also used here the on-premise data gateway for forwarding the user. However, in this scenario with OData services exposed by the backend system, we used the open authorization framework and protocol, so the OAuth protocol, and used a token exchange using SAML assertions here from the security assertion markup language to do the token exchange and interoperable token exchange between Power Platform and the backend system. Now for RFCs, this doesn't work, but fortunately, we now got these new features in the on-premises data gateway that also allows us to essentially implement a very similar scenario like the one for OData services, now with the new features introduced in the on-premises data gateway. This time now with calling an RFC from a Power Platform application. And we are using now a regular Canvas app here in this scenario for calling the RFC on the backend. So OAuth is no longer the protocol we use for authenticating and propagating the user to the backend in combination with SAML. But now, this time, we are using Kerberos, or to be more specific, Kerberos constraint delegation to propagate the user, or delegate or propagate the user to the RFC, or to make this call in the backend and to enforce all of the user's roles and permissions and authorizations of the user, so that the user can only invoke those RFCs that he is allowed to do. In this demo setup, so this is a more high-level overview. We also have Azure AD Connect, as you can see here on the lower right part here of this picture. This ensures that, for example, a user working from the corporate network on a AD joined workstation can seamlessly single sign on to a Power App and using the authentication token obtained by the Power App using or that the Power App got from the Azure Active Directory tenant. That token essentially is forwarded via the SAP ERP Connector to the on-premises data gateway in this step number 4. Then the on-premises data gateway then does actually a token exchange. So it uses Kerberos constraint delegation to obtain a service ticket for that SAP backend system, and then uses that Kerberos ticket, which is issued to the authenticated user on the Power Platform to make a call to the RFC on the backend. And certainly this requires some setup and configuration on a few components here shown in this diagram. For example, you need to set up so-called service accounts and service principal names assigned to those service accounts in the Active Directory domain controller that essentially allows the on-premises data gateway to make this constraint Kerberos delegation for obtaining the ticket on behalf of the user. You also require in such a scenario to map the AD authenticated user or actually the Azure AD authenticated user, if we have AD Connect here in place, to map that user on the backend system to the SNC name or user principal name that the user has in the Active Directory. So an SNC mapping is also required, as it is for regular SAP GUI single sign-on, where you also need to map or maintain those mappings in the user maintenance of the users in the backend system. I will take a look at that in a second. Now let's jump to the demo. My setup is quite straightforward. So I have like simulated here on my machine, on my laptop, a corporate network that implements a simple setup of a Active Directory domain. So I have a domain controller that where the on-premises data gateway is joined to. So this is also required because otherwise the on-premises data gateway would not be able to use Kerberos constraint delegation for obtaining the ticket for the user. So the host that runs the on-premises data gateway is domain joined. I have a user that will access in a browser the Power App, and in order to do so, the user needs to sign on to the Azure AD tenant that is synchronized using Azure AD Connect, so that the user can use their known passwords to log in to the Azure AD tenant. And then this Power App uses the SAP ERP Connector, which is incorporated into a Power Automate flow to call the on-premises data gateway and make use of the new features in the ERP connector and the on-premises data gateway to call a BAPI, which calls or which searches in an sample product catalog from the EPM model in the backend system for a specific product ID, and will return the price of that product from the product catalog all the way back to the Power App. So that's our scenario.
I think it looks fairly complicated.
Yeah.
But in the end, I think if there are all these individual pieces and they need to come together, obviously, somehow. But once you get a better understanding of how it works, then it is actually fairly simple, I would say. It takes some time to get into it. But then when you understand that, okay, you have this one ticket there that you get, then you need to translate it to a Kerberos token, and then you need to use this to connect to the SAP system. You can easily follow. And I also want to highlight, this is the first time that you need to set this up, right? I mean, after that, you have single sign-on in place.
Oh, yes.
And then the end user doesn't care about this anymore. The end user can then just really focus on building the Power Apps or building a Power Automate flow or whatever.
Absolutely. We can quickly maybe also take a look at the developers, at the Power Platform developers perspective to all of this. Yeah, and it's quite straightforward. That's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, there's a one-time setup that is needed. Yeah, such as, for example, setting up those service accounts for the one for the gateway, one for the backend, registering the correct service principal names here. Yeah, so there's a little bit of an one-time initial setup that's needed. And by the way, as a sneak preview, so we will I plan certainly also to document what we showed today in this podcast as another part of my SAP blog posts around principal propagation in the various scenarios and setups. So there will be hopefully in a few 1 or 2 weeks a new part 7 of my blog series, where you can hopefully then easily follow all these steps that are required to set up this scenario. But I fully agree, Holger, you are absolutely right. So once the initial setup is done, I, as a Power Platform developer, it's quite straightforward then to make use of this setup to propagate the authenticated user and make calls to RFCs and BAPIs. Definitely. Yeah. All right. So let me go straight to the, maybe first of all, let me quickly show you how the Power Automate flow looks like. So this is the Power Automate flow that is called by the Power App. when the user clicks on the button to search for the product ID. That product ID is then that is entered in a text field in the Power App is then passed to this Power Automate flow. And as you can see, we are now using here this so-called call SAP function V2 operation from the SAP ERP Connector. It requires some also again some initial setup, which is here formatted as a JSON string to instruct the ERP Connector regarding the coordinates for getting to the SAP system and using SNC as a single sign-on protocol for connecting or obtaining the Kerberos ticket on behalf of the user. This also requires, by the way, to install the SAP COM cryptolib on the gateway host. And the path, for example, here, so the local path on the gateway host is also part of this configuration. Yeah? And then essentially you pick and choose the BAPI RFC you want to call from. And I've also show this here. So this is another sample flow that also makes use here of this call SAP function from the ERP connector. If you drop down this list here, you see that the connector now retrieves all of the RFCs and BAPIs that are available in the backend system that you configured here. And then as a Power Platform developer, you can easily pick and choose the one you want to use in your scenario, and then provide, if required, certain input parameters and get also the response parameters to work with them in the course of your flow.
So cool. Yeah. So basically they are pre-filled and you don't have to search for them.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. It's quite convenient. Yeah. So I, as a developer, I think you definitely get here a lot of a very good convenient environment for building those. Yeah.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. So as I said, the Power App itself is quite simple. It just and let us maybe just now jump into the demo right now. So let me just copy the link to this Power App that calls this flow. I will now use this link in a new in private window. So I need to sign in now to my Azure AD tenant. And I can do so with my known corporate password, because I'm it's synchronized using AD Connect in my setup. So now I'm getting logged on to the Power App. All right. And if I now enter a product, an ID of a product that I know that exists. I mean, I can also, but we want to see a price tag now associated with that product. So before I do so, let me on the gateway host also quickly start a recording of the so this is the host system that runs the on-premises data gateway. As you can see, it's up and running, so it's waiting for requests coming in. And just as to illustrate that something happens now, I will now start Wireshark, which, by the way, is a great tool in case something goes wrong and you need to analyze the single sign-on message flow for this constrained Kerberos delegation. Then this is a great tool to track and trace the calls that are made. So let me filter for Kerberos messages. And now let's go back to our Power App and click on search. And now the flow is invoked. And as you can see, we see a price tag here coming back from the backend. In the course here of the call, maybe let's go first to the Power Automate flow. So if we go back here, so that was the flow that was called. We see that a recent call was made, so 24 seconds ago. We can also go into here, which is, by the way, also a great place to look if something went wrong. This is a great means here to investigate any potential issues. So here we can see that the call was made successfully, and we can also see the full response from that BAPI call. Takes a little time to load this instance data. But as you can see, this was my input, that was passed to that RFC call or to that BAPI call, and then we get back a result based on my search that I did. And then in the course of the following steps here in the Power Automate flow, I'm just passing out here from that JSON response the price tag of that product. So we've also seen that on the on-premises data gateway host, there obviously also took some, or there were also some messages recorded. Those are now the Kerberos protocol messages that we see. And finally, let me quickly take a look at one of them. We see that a ticket has been issued to a user, so to send that ticket to the SAP backend system. And let me see if I also find here the user's name. Let me just see if I can get that here as well. Okay, I probably need to find the right one here. So, but I think the most important part is here that what we see is that that ticket has been issued to the gateway system, acting on behalf of the user to consume an RFC on that SAP backend system. And this is exactly the service principal name that was registered in or for the system. We can also take a look at the domain controller here to see what has been done here. So there is a service account that represents the SAP backend system. It's called here Kerberos, followed by the system ID A4H. And if we check the, with this command set SPN, the registered service principal names, we exactly see that name that also appeared in the Kerberos protocol trace, that this system is registered under this service principal name in our Active Directory. And again, this is like an initial one-time setup that you need to do correctly. After that, no more changes need to be done on this side. Just to prove that we really are calling the SAP system on behalf of that user that we used here to log on to our Power App, let me go to the backend system and remove the authorizations given to that user. So I am here logged in to the backend system, and let me go into transaction SU01 for the user maintenance. So Jack Davis is the user we use to log in. So let's change the user's roles. And by the way, while we are in this transaction, I can also quickly mention here, again, it's important, similar to other Kerberos single sign-on scenarios, for example, with SAP GUI, that the SNC mapping is maintained for the user. Otherwise, the scenario will also or won't work. Because in the end, the gateway sends a service a service ticket on behalf of the user identified under this user principal name, and corresponding mapping needs to be maintained in the backend system so that the user can be mapped to a known backend user. Now, under roles, we see that the user has been assigned to a product search role. So this product search role is configured with the authorization objects that are required to make this specific RFC call. Now, let's just remove that role from the user and see what happens if we then make another call. So now the user no longer has this role and should have lost now all the authorizations given to the user to call this product details RFC or BAPI. So now let's try again. Let's make this new search. And now it should take a little bit longer because the Power Automate flow is also configured to at least try one more time if the first call fails, there may be other reasons, such as lost connectivity maybe or whatever. But after 30 seconds, we should see now an error message in this Power App that tells us that the user doesn't have the required authorizations in order to make this search call in the backend. So let's see if
maybe
this.
Just while we wait, just to highlight again. So you didn't have to specify any SAP username or password, because the only thing that you had was to enter your Azure Active Directory credentials to log on to Power Automate. Obviously, there we could have multi-factor authentication, everything that comes with Azure Active Directory.
Yep.
Then the Power Automate call or flow called the on-premises data gateway, where we have the SAP.NET connector installed to make then the call to the SAP system. But the on-premises data gateway fetched the Kerberos or was able to get a Kerberos token from the domain controller on behalf of the user, basically.
Exactly.
Then do the call to the BAPI with this user, and there obviously now was this trust that the Kerberos token was okay. So I'll let you in. There was this check for the SPN for the for this this mapping that was done in the SAP system.
Exactly.
And now, since we have removed the role for this specific user, we are getting an error message.
Now we're getting an error message that says there are no RFC authorizations for that function. And one of them is this RFC ping. But by removing that role, I essentially removed all of the authorizations that are required. There are a few authorization objects needed in order to allow the user to call this specific BAPI. And with that, we essentially now proved this new feature in the ERP connector. One more thing to also mention, you certainly also exactly go through the same on the backend system, also through the same setup steps as you would do for regular SAP GUI single sign-on.
Yes.
So you, for example, need to as a really one-time setup task, you need to go through the SNC wizard transaction to set up the SNC parameters in the backend and make the backend and essentially pass the credentials of the service account in your Active Directory that represents the SAP system, in your corporate network, and you need to pass those credentials to the backend system, to the SAP system, so that the key or this hashed key can be generated from those credentials, so that the backend system can also validate that this token is a valid token and or ticket, the Kerberos ticket, and so that this so-called offline Kerberos validation takes place using the SAP Common Cryptolib in the backend system. So very similar steps to other common Kerberos single sign-on scenarios for SNC in the SAP system, just now in a slightly different use case. So no SAP GUI single sign-on, but principal propagation in the context of Power App consumption of BAPIs and RFCs.
And what's great that basically the end user get really the correct message, to know, that I have problem and this is the error. Can you please fix it there? So it's helpful. It's super.
Absolutely. Maybe also one last comment. So all of this will be available with the May release of the on-premises data gateway. I think it will come out. So since we already have May, I think it will be out quite soon. So implementing that scenario, its prerequisite is to have the May 2023 release of the on-premises data gateway.
Because there were some last-minute mapping fixes, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, and with that, I hope you got a good idea of this scenario, and hope it makes you also interested in implementing such scenario. And as I said, I will follow up with a step-by-step documentation of setting this up as part of my blog series.
No passwords, great.
No passwords, exactly.
Passwords,
Secure single sign-on.
Yes.
No, thank you, Martin. And I mean, knowing the previous 6 blog posts that you have in the principal propagation, I'm sure this will also be, again, a really fantastic, detailed step-by-step guide in one place, because I think that is one thing that I always like. You want to set up single sign-on for Power Platform and SAP, and you don't need to jump around and get some documentation here and some documentation there and something there, but you have everything then in your one blog post. So I'm definitely looking forward to that one.
That's the main objective. Exactly. Yeah.
Perfect.
All right.
Good. Then, Martin, thank you very much for joining. I'm sure we'll have you again in the future. But for now, yeah, look forward to the new blog post. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.